All right. Good evening, everyone. Uh, just one moment, please. Right. So let's get started with today's class. This is our second class in our series of classes for that. Second class with me, that is. I'll be we are working on perfecting our preparation for XAT VALR, which is verbal ability and logical reasoning section. As everyone knows, and in the prior class also, someone had left a comment. I'd asked students to actually leave a comment about what they want me to teach or what is left out from the prior classes, etc., etc. So some students asked specifically for how to tackle poems. We are anyways going to study poems in today's class. So I think it's fairly evident that students generally see this as a challenge in the XAT exam. And of course, as always, the RC remains a challenge. So let's start with today's class. We're learning to perfect or optimize our ability to tackle the XAT RC and the poem. Uh, for starters, the XAT RC is not that much different from the CAT RC, right? XAT and CAT are somewhat equal in terms of the level of difficulty. Some might even say that the XAT RCs are sometimes much harder, right? Uh, so, for starters, let's just say that if you've attended, I've done a lot of these live classes on our channel for CAT as well. So, those classes are going to be especially useful if you're working towards, perfecting your RC. So, the CAT classes would also be useful. I'll focus on the XAT RC today. All right. So it's fairly similar, right? The poem is a new addition. So I'll talk about the poem in the second half of today's class. So first, let's start with this idea of how to get better at our VALR section. And again, please refer to the prior classes. Some students I know have attended the prior classes and do attend my classes regularly, so you know what I'm talking about. But for those of you who are attending for the first time, let me just simply repeat this. And it's important for the students who know this also to sort of, ingrain this in their solving process. All right. So the key difference in verbal ability or solving passages or anything to do with verbal in an aptitude exam is that we are expected to be methodical. Now, what does that mean? Let's take quant or your logical reasoning in CAT or any other exam for that matter. Right here, these subjects themselves, for example, probability, or let's say arrangement question, right? Like a railway timetable scheduling arrangement sort of a question. If you notice, these question types, these sections themselves impose a certain method of solving on us. In the quant section, we are expected to use a formula and be really rigorous in terms of when we're applying the formula. And in the reasoning section, again, we're expected to go through the data points, arrange them in a specific way. So the method is imposed by the data points on us, right? The problem and the challenge with reading comprehension or poems or, let's say para summary, critical reasoning, any of these question types is you get a bunch of written text. And since we have, developed our reading skills as individuals, we each read in a slightly different way, which is native to our own reading as individuals. Now, the problem is that's not necessarily methodical, and that's not necessarily what the exam is looking for. So, what we have to do is we all have to tailor our way of reading to a specific way of reading, which means that we are supposed to achieve a certain thing when we're done reading this. Correct? And that implies we develop a method such that it becomes a habit. Now, why is it important for us to practice this method so much that it becomes a habit? So, now that I've spoken about why for verbal ability we need to be methodical, let me just briefly talk about what is the distinction between simply having a method and making it a habit, right? The method would be something that I described to you right now. The habit is important because the moment there is time pressure, the moment there, you feel that maybe your first few questions were possibly wrong, you're not certain about the choices you made, then for the following questions, for the next questions, and because of the time pressure, we tend to return back to our native reading process, which is quite chaotic, right? We might read a passage in a hodgepodge way, sort of read it in a circular fashion. We might read options first and then go to the passage because we're in a hurry, we notice some certain word, so on and so forth, right? So we want to separate ourselves from the chaos caused by the timer or by us going possibly wrong, and maintain our methodical approach, right? So to maintain this methodical approach, we need to make sure that we push ourselves and practice enough that it becomes a habit. All right. So this implies all of us have to continue practicing, that the method becomes an habit. This means each of us has to practice differently, so on and so forth, for more amount of time, less amount of time, based on each of us, right? So let me very briefly give you a quick overview of the method involved, right? Now let's take a passage like this, right? This is a RC passage from the 2023 paper. So 2023 XAT paper. So what I want you to realize is that's just a piece of text, and we don't have any context. We don't have any topic. We don't have, as in, we don't have any title to the text. There's no title. There's no subtitle. There's simply the text. So we don't have any frame of reference. We need to create that frame of reference first. All right. That's the one thing that you want to remember. That first step is to create that frame of reference. So creating that frame of reference means you need to read to identify the main point of the passage first. This is step one of the method, right? Now, step one would involve maybe reading each line sometimes twice, sometimes thrice, based on how many ever readings a line takes. Sometimes we would have to read the passage twice, right? So this changes from passage to passage, and this changes from person to person. But we need to reduce the passage to a level where we all can say something marks the main point, meaning that some certain words, let me mark them in blue here, some certain words in the text clearly highlight the author's main point, right? So these words, if you notice, these are words I've marked in the passage because I can point to those words. This is not an interpretation done by me. This is something stated by the author, right? These words are stated by the author, and that's why this is important. So what I mean by this is important is we can trust this source completely, which is the RC. This is the reading comprehension. This is written by the author. We can fully trust this. If we make a habitual error, if we are under pressure, if we choose something wrong, what we end up doing is we might go to the options too soon. Now, these we cannot trust. This is information created by the examiner, right? This is information which is laden with traps, with words which can be misconstrued by us, misunderstood by us. So all of this can't be trusted. So what we need to understand is, unless and until we create a clear image of this first, there is no point going to step two, which is then moving to the options, right? So step two would be then moving to options or the question, right? Now, when it comes to the options or the question, what I want you to remember about being methodical is, do not solve based on memory. This is very important. A lot of times what happens is, especially when we're in a hurry or maybe we have a bad habit, once we are done reading the passage, like I said, maybe twice, thrice, etc., we start reading the options and start solving them based on our memory, which is what we've read earlier. This is an incorrect approach. The examiner knows this, right? And that is why the examiner is going to use words which can be easily misconstrued to confuse us, correct? So what you want to do is, with each option that you read, you want to look for evidence that tells you the option may be problematic. right? And in many cases, all the options will have some problematic words, right? Each option will have some problematic words. So first identify a problematic word, that is step one. Then go to the passage and check if that's acceptable or not, right? And let's say this is not acceptable. So option A is invalid because this word is not acceptable. Let's say option B also you check, not acceptable based on what is stated in the original source, which is the passage. Therefore, option B is invalid. Now, when it comes to option C and D, and this will happen in many questions because this is how the examiner designs a paper. The design is such that most students, let's say 80 or 90%, can eliminate two options, and then there'll be a clash between two options. So let's say there's a clash between options C and D. Now, at this stage, you want to check whether this is acceptable or this is acceptable, and you need to look for evidence, right? And suppose you find no evidence for option C, and there is a problematic word in option D, but you find some piece of evidence for it in the passage. And therefore, even though there is something problematic stated in option D, since there is evidence for it, then you can mark option D as the right answer. Okay. This is the method of solving. I want you to, firstly, I understand that it's a fully colored screen. Rewatch this part of the class if you want. I want you to practice the passage so many times that this method becomes a habit, right? This sequence of solving becomes mechanical for you, right? You apply this process even if there's a time crunch, even if there is whatever going on. All right, so this is being methodical. This is what will guarantee you marks. When you say optimize performance in VARC or VALR, students often don't know how to improve, and that's because this sort of minor slips. Suppose I start tackling option C and D based on memory alone because I'm in a hurry, then that minor slip is going to lead to an error, right? But if you mechanically develop this habit or method that you are continuously looking at the passage for information, looking for evidence, then your accuracy is going to shoot up, right? So this is about us being methodical. Okay. Right. Now, let's start with discussing the XAT RC. The number of RCs changes. I've discussed this in the prior class. Usually there are 4 RCs. Sometimes there was 5 RCs. The number of questions for RCs could be 12 questions, 13 questions, sometimes 14 questions based on how XAT decides to, challenge us or trouble us. So for RCs, I want you to look at, and I'll also discuss where to practice. I want you to look at prior XAT papers, of course. This is of lot of value. Prior CAT papers also, especially, and I've discussed this in the prior class, 91 till 2008 CAT papers. To those of you who don't have time, who are feeling they're short of time, at least simply read the CAT papers. By what I mean by read the CAT paper, I want you to read the RC and read the question and simply look at the solutions. You'll find the official solutions in the papers online. Simply look at the solutions. If you don't have time, if you have time, solve them. Right? This is where you practice from. The number of RCs changes, and the number of RCs you're supposed to attempt would change based on student to student. Right? So, how do I decide which RCs to select or omit? And like I've mentioned before, I'll rewrite this for all of y'all. There are 4 or 3 ways in which the examiner decides to increase or decrease the level of difficulty of material in the verbal section, right? One is the length of sentences, right? The second is difficult words or language, right? And third is a completely new concept, a new idea. Suppose there's some new development in physics, science, etc., right? And then they just present that passage to us. We don't know what any of those new concepts mean, and therefore that adds to a level of difficulty. So to decide which RC to solve and not to solve should be based on these 3 factors, right? And remember that there is, if I say there are 4 RCs, there is no perfect ideal way for us to align them in the order of difficulty. Let's say this is the order of difficulty. RC2 is the easiest, then RC4 is the relatively harder one, then 3, and then 1 is the hardest, suppose. But this is just us talking random gibberish. This can't be done in real time in the exam, right? So what instead we do is we use these factors, right, to simply decide which RC to not solve at that moment, right? So do this only for extreme RCs. When you look at this length of sentences is very long, when you find difficult words and you find new concepts, right? When you find all these three things and you can see that the RC is quite long and dense, then you can decide to omit it, right? So take these decisions of omission very rarely, and that way you end up selecting the optimum amount of question anyways, right? So rarely decide to omit a few RCs, and you'll end up omitting maybe one or two RCs based on the needs of that paper. All right. So this is about selection or omission of RCs. Use these factors to decide which RCs to select or omit. You can quickly scan an RC. Like I'll give you an example. You can use these factors and quickly solve an RC. Look at whether this RC is difficult, easy, or moderate. Right? Let's try this. And okay. Now let's quickly scan. Interpretation in our own time is etc. etc. Contemporary zeal, piety, open aggressiveness, overt contempt, old style of interpretation was insistent, etc. etc. So by now I know that the RC is the length of sentences was fine, right? There was some difficult language of interpretation and interpretation being complex. There's no such new, completely novel concept that we saw in the first four lines. I just scanned the first 4 or 5 lines, if you notice, not sentences, lines. So I know that RC is somewhat moderate. So not something I'll omit. So that's all the decision I quickly take each time I see an RC. All right. So this is about how to select or omit RCs. And like I said, please rewatch this section if you need to. I don't want to repeat myself. I know there are some doubts cropping up and there are some students asking some questions, but we need to address a lot of topics. So let me get through these. And then if I have time, I'll address those doubts. Otherwise, you can drop them in the comment section and we have another class next week and I'll make sure to address those doubts. Right. So let's see what is required for our total verbal section. I discussed this already. Some piece of written material where we don't have any frame of reference. We need to have the ability to simplify that piece of written material and then have the ability to evaluate that piece of material. All right. So these are the two targets that we are supposed to achieve. Now, and this a lot of times this is a challenge for me and teachers teaching verbal in general and for students as well, is that I want to communicate a certain way of reading to you, right? And all of us have our own way of reading. So I don't simply want to reread the passage. That's not of any help to you. So I want all of you all to read the passage first and try and achieve this, which is about, and by the way, this can be applied to any written material in your VARC section, is that about a certain VLR section, about a certain topic, the author is saying something specific. I want you to use the words in the passage, the author's words, to fill these blanks, right? And hopefully not use too many words, use as few words as possible. So that way, what by doing this exercise, what we do is we end up achieving an understanding of the main point of the author with a lot of specificity. We're using the author's words to know what the topic of discussion is, and we're using the author's words to know what is said about the topic. This will give us the main point. And if you all remember, this is our first step of reading. Okay. So I'll talk about simplification and evaluation as I read, and I'll tell you about a few habits that you need to develop as I read. But first, I want all of you all to read the passage. So let's get started. I'll wait for around 2.5 minutes. Please get started. All right, that's about ample time, around 2 minutes 15 seconds for reading this RC. A few things about this RC, you'll notice that the length is not too long. It's a short RC. XAT will sometimes ask long and short RCs like CAT earlier used to. So I prefer the short one because it's better for us to discuss methods of reading, methods of solving, etc. The long RC is a little problematic for us to discuss. Okay, so as uh, as you would have noticed, the RC has words which many of us may not know the meanings of, like such as I didn't know the meaning of hermeneutics, right? I knew an associated word which is exegesis, which is another unnecessary, some spelling like this, exegesis, right? Unnecessary word, but I didn't know the exact meaning of hermeneutics. So, right. So the reason why I'm telling you this is we all will come across words or language in the exam which we don't know the meaning of. Our ability to therefore simplify, which is overcome a difficult word, right, by understanding its meaning and then evaluate that information, is therefore being tested. So I want to discuss the reading process in a few ways. I want to tell you one thing is that some sentences require multiple readings, others require one single reading. This also changes from person to person, subject to subject. Subject of interpretation for a literature student would probably be much easier than for an economics student. So it changes from student to student, person to person. Right. So let's get started with the reading process. I don't simply want to repeat what is being said. So what I've done is I've marked the passage in a way where it will be clear to you what is said. But before we go to that, I want to tell you a few things about this passage. One is, let's say we start with the first sentence is telling us interpretation is more complex. The current, especially in our time, the current project of interpretation is not prompted by XYZ, but by an open aggressiveness towards contempt for appearances. So this is trying to, I'm just roughly describing what the passage is doing. And then in the next slide, I'll tell you exactly what the author was trying to say. So the first few lines are trying to describe what interpretation today is, right? The old style of interpretation was something, and today's style, the modern style of interpretation, is supposed to be something. Then what I wanted to notice, and this is what I wanted to tell you about developing habits, is that many authors will either actually give you an openly give you an example, or others will give you a like a comparison or an alliteration. All of these are told or given to us to explain some author's concept. So here the author wanted to explain interpretation in our own time or ideas about interpretation. So to do that, the author has relied on these two thinkers, the most celebrated thinkers who have spoken about interpretation, right? And using their ideas of interpretation, the author is explaining interpretation to us. So the reason why it's important to identify when the author is giving us an example is because then I can sort of treat the example as I know the objective of that example and I don't need to analyze it too much. I know why it's being given. It's being given to me so that I understand what interpretation means, right? This is the one thing of habit that I wanted to show you from this, is to notice examples. The other is when you notice sentences like this, thus interpretation is not this XYZ, but interpretation is something else. This sentence, let me mark it in another color, is clearly trying to explain interpretation to us. So this means that, and this applies to all difficult passages, if you find a relatively easier section which is explanatory, make sure you take a conscious decision of reading this part twice, thrice, how many ever times you need to clearly understand what the author is trying to do. This is a conscious choice we have to choose to make, right? So these are the two habits I wanted to develop. One is notice an example whenever and however it's given to you. Second is notice explanatory sentences or simple sentences which are trying to explain things and reread those sentences consciously, right? So I'm just going to wait here and I want you to read only the words I've marked in green. Please read them twice. I'll just wait for a moment. All right. So I'll reread them along with you and I'll show you what I've done. When I say simplify something, that does not mean I just reread sentences blindly. I'm selective about what I reread. Correct? So, first line is trying to tell us interpretation today is more complex. Right? Today's interpretation is often not prompted by piety. Piety means this appreciation or having faith towards the troublesome text. So, even if we didn't understand this, but today's interpretation in our own time, is something which has open aggression in it. Okay, this is explained further. The old style was insistent but respectful. This already tells us what the new style is. New style is basically not respectful. The old style was trying to find another meaning on top of the literal one. So it read something and then it looked for a deeper meaning. The modern style is excavation. It excavates, it digs behind the text, right, to find a subtext which is the true one. So, distinction between the old style of interpretation, modern style of interpretation. If you notice, I haven't bothered with the example too much. In the example, I've just focused on one part, or I've reread only one part, which is the manifest content, meaning whatever is the content is presented, must be probed and pushed aside. So you have to read something and push it aside to find the true meaning. That is what this example of Marx and Freud is telling us. Now, we are told these texts have no meaning without interpretation. So, a text doesn't have any meaning unless and until we consciously interpret it. To understand something is to interpret it, and to interpret it is to restate. So, what is interpretation in our own time is given in these sentences here, all these sentences. Correct? So, like I said, I expect you to reread those sentences. Thus, interpretation is not, as most people assume, an absolute value. Interpretation must itself be evaluated. All right. So, this is how I expect you to selectively read sentences. Words like hermeneutics, this actually stands for, like I said, exegesis, which is uh, analysis of religious text, right? And words like impertinent means rude, reactionary would mean someone who has a very conservative attitude, or stifling is, suffocating, etc., etc. So these words, this is what they mean. What I want you to realize is, even without knowing their individual meanings, we have grasped what the author wanted to say. So this is the simplification process that I expect you to follow, right? Now I want us to start with the questions. And the habit I told you about the questions was that for the options, I want you to go back to the passage for pretty much each option and check whether it's acceptable or not. But for a question like this, where a part of the passage is quoted, please go back to that part of the passage first before you visit these traps. These are traps, right? Before you visit these traps, you go to that part of the passage first and you look at what the actual text said, what the actual author said. Then you go to the options. Please get started. I want everyone to type in their answers when they're done. And I know there would be doubts cropping up, but like I said, leave them in the comment section. We have a lot of ground to cover today. All right. Let me go through the question along with you all. I'm sure someone would have selected their answers. Please drop in your answers. What does the author mean by thus interpretation is not a gesture of the mind situated in some timeless realm of capabilities? So, in short, if you look at this sentence, let me just mark it carefully. Is that let's look at this sentence as thus interpretation is, let's look at the first half as interpretation is not X, and let's look at this part of the sentence as interpretation is not X but Y. So the second half is this but Y is defining what interpretation is, correct? If you look at that part of the sentence, interpretation must itself be evaluated, correct? So interpretation is not something, but interpretation is something where you're evaluating interpretation itself. So interpretation must itself be evaluated is basically like saying reinterpretation, right? So interpretation is reinterpretation. All right. So, or repeated revising or analysis. Now that I have captured what the author has said, and this will tell you why being methodical is important. Let's go to the options. And each option you'll notice will have some problem. Interpretation is an act of understanding developed by timeless experts. So this is not an absolute value, not some timeless value. So developed by timeless experts is actually opposite of what is stated in the passage. So option A is invalid. If you notice, none of this is, I'm not going about these options based on feel or how they sound. I'm going based on evidence, right? Let's look at option B. Interpretation is about erecting another meaning on top of a literal one. In the actual exam, a lot of students went with option B because they had read the passage in a hurry and they were trying to solve based on memory. But if you notice, option B is actually about the old style of interpretation, right? Here we are told old style is another meaning on top of the literal one, erecting another meaning on top of literal one. So this is actually invalid. This is the old style of interpretation. Again, an option that I'm eliminating based on evidence, not my internal description or memory. Let's look at option C. Interpretation is an act of the mind. This is a little problematic, not stated, which is situated in a changeless domain. It's not changeless. Interpretation must itself be evaluated. It is not timeless. So again, invalid. Based on evidence and specific words, we have declared A, B, and C invalid. Let's look at D. Interpretation is about revisiting and reinventing meanings. All right. Now, if you notice, at least to me, revisiting is completely fine, right? Reinventing sounds a little problematic, right? So if you go across the passage and look for it, it'll be a little problematic to find it. So we'll put D aside. Let's look at E. Interpretation is being evaluative, okay, of the meaning created by an authority, right? So meaning created by an authority and evaluating that meaning. This definition is nowhere found in the passage. So we don't actually get evidence for option D. So the right answer is option D, right? We don't get evidence for option E. Sorry, right? So the right answer is option D. So this is the process of solving each question. I just want you to remember this, and this is the method that I want you to drill through practice. Once this entire solving method from start to end becomes mechanical, meaning you can apply it under pressure, under time pressure, etc., then your accuracy is going to shoot up, right? Let's look at the next question, everyone. Okay, let's start with question number 2. Please follow the same process. All right. I think that's ample time for this question. According to the passage, which of the following is not an act of interpretation? The questions which will ask you which of the following is not something. Now, these questions usually just for you to remember in case you want to, not solve a particular question, etc., etc. These questions usually take time. The reason being, in this case, I mean, this is relatively easy. Usually they take time because there'll be 4 options which are valid and 1 invalid. We need to identify that. So to look for 4 valid options would mean we have to search through the passage. Takes a little bit of time, and just more information for us to go through. Right? That's one idea. Keep that in mind. So according to the passage, which of the following is not an act of interpretation? In this case, unless and until you know unless and until you know what is an act of interpretation, you can't really answer this question, right? And we know what is an act of interpretation based on these sentences here, from here till here. And even after, I mean, ahead, the author is talking about interpretation, on what interpretation means only today. But this is enough for us to answer most questions. And it doesn't have all of this complicated language of reactionary, impertinent, cowardly, stifling, etc. So this is enough for us to say what actually is interpretation. So based on that, there'll be 4 valid interpretation acts, 1 invalid, that we need to identify. Now, if you notice, let's look at one: investigating some class conflict, right? Like, classes in terms of Marxism, or in terms of, like we know, middle class, lower class, upper class, etc. These, so-called sociological divides. Investigating class conflict in a novel. In any novel, they could have mentioned any novel, doesn't necessarily mean it has to be a Dickens novel. All right. But this would be valid interpretation because you're investigating something behind the text, right? The manifest content must be probed and pushed aside to find the true meaning. This is happening. To understand is to interpret. This is happening. To interpret is to restate. This is happening, right? So 1 is valid. B or A is valid. B, and it's not our answer. B says finding underlying causes of social evil described in the book. Underlying causes is here must be probed and pushed aside to find the true meaning. Interpretation must be itself evaluated. You're evaluating something and you're evaluating under that text as well. So B is valid. C is searching for underlying themes in a historical document. This is valid as well, not our answer. Critical appreciation of a literary text. Critical appreciation would mean an analysis of a literary text. This could be any text. Economic text, right? Marx has written about economics. We can reinterpret or reevaluate or analyze Marx's works as valid, invalid, howsoever. So that would mean economic text is justified, just like in this case, Tolkien's novels would be justified, any other novel would be justified. So A, B, C, D are all valid. These are valid ways of interpreting. And this is actually coming from this sentence more than these sentences, to be honest, but both these would help us define what interpretation is. What is not an act of interpretation is labeling a text as blasphemous. Now, what I want to show you from this question is sometimes there are options where we don't know the meaning of a particular word. Blasphemous, by the way, means something that is ungodly or against God, right? So labeling a text as a certain thing is not interpretation. Interpretation means we are analyzing it. So if I say that I think a text is X. So I've labeled that text, right? I've labeled this text as X. This is not interpretation. You should read text X and then you should decide, or rather, you should read text A, and based on that, you should decide whether it's X or Y or Z, correct? So interpretation is not labeling a text, right? So this answer, which is E, could be found based on these words alone. This is not a act of interpretation. Labeling is not an act of interpretation, and interpretation is an active act. It must have evaluation in it. It must not have an absolute value. It should not be labeling a text. Labeling would be an absolute value, right? So E is the correct answer. And again, we were methodical. We looked for information in the passage to confirm these. We looked for information in the passage to confirm this is problematic. E is the right answer for question number 2. Let's look at the third question. This is the last question from this passage. Please get started with this. All right. This is a really easy question. I expect most students to get this right. Even in the exam, with a few students whom I have interacted with, they did get this right. Which of the following best differentiates manifest content from the latent content? Now, the reason why this is relatively easy is it's factual. It's based on the sentence which we have already marked. Manifest, and remember that when I read this, the method part is that I look for this first. I read this first, and then second step is to go to the options. I don't go to the options first because, like I said, these are all traps, right? This applies to para summary solving also, by the way. I've discussed this in prior classes. Let's look at each option. A says manifest content is natural, latent content is cultural. This is not stated, invalid, doesn't apply to what is stated here. Manifest content is apparent, which is what we see, and latent content is hidden. This looks like a somewhat ideal answer. The problem with a question like this with best is we want to make sure there is not a better interpretation than option B, right? So we quickly go through these. Manifest content is superset. This is subset, obviously invalid, nothing like this stated in the passage. So superset, subset, not found in the passage. Cultural, not found in the passage. Manifest content is loaded, elusive. These concepts are not found in the passage. And manifest content is obscure. Latent content is lucid. Lucid would mean clear. Actually, latent content would not be clear. We have to search for it. We have to excavate for it. We have to dig for it. So lucid and clear would be invalid. So the right answer, as most of you all will get it, is that option B is the right choice based on the passage. All right. This concludes our RC part of the class. Remember the method. Those of you who want to revisit a part of the class, I'm taking this in a very orderly fashion. So please revisit parts wherever you need to, go through the process that I've described again. And that's really important, like I said, for improving accuracy. Now let's look at the poem. The first thing that I want to start with is, I think the poem can be skipped by most students. The poem usually, in most cases so far, the poem has had 2 questions. And if there is an upside to the poem, is that the first question is fixed. This is fixed, or sort of fixed. I mean, for most years they've asked this question. So I am fairly sure that in 2025, this question, what best conveys the theme of the poem, will be asked, right? Like I'm 99% sure it will be asked if a poem is asked. Okay. Now, the reason why I'm saying to attempt or not is, firstly, I don't know why XAT asks poetry as analysis. It's analyzing poetry can be really fun, but if you just look up how to read poetry, most of it would be like, don't read it fast, right? Or at least the gist of it would be, it's not speed reading. So we are solving at speed in the exam. So it's kind of counterintuitive that they're asking poems, but it's still fun and challenging, etc., etc. So we'll try and think of how to solve it. And for those students who are good at this sort of stuff, it's a clear advantage to solve this, because you know the first question what is going to be. And like I said, if you're sort of good at this stuff, it's a clear advantage to solve the poem, because most other students would not be solving. So take a call, right? And what is expected is, let's look at the 2023 poem. Look at the length of this poem. Two questions would be asked from this. To read this and understand this is going to take 2.5 minutes at the least. Then to solve each question is going to add another at least 2.5 minutes to your solving time. So that's 5 minutes of solving time for two questions. I would say at this length, which is XAT actually used to ask this length of poem a lot of times. In the past few years, they've reduced it to this length. The 2021 and the 2022 poems were even shorter than this, right? So I think when it's of this length and when it has only two questions, it can be safely skipped unless it's an advantage and unless you've worked on this problem. This is a problem for all of us, and we all need to work on it by practicing. Provided this is not a challenge, I expect you to tackle the poem. The other thing is, for a short poem, if it's a really short poem and you're sort of good at this stuff, you can solve the first question really quickly. Okay. So this is just a general idea about what to choose or not to choose. By the way, final decision about whether you attempt the poem or not should not be based on this class alone. I expect you to solve at least 4 or 5 previous year papers where you do solve the poem, right? And then you take a call whether you'll actually do it in the exam or not, right? So today we'll solve the 2024 poem and we'll just get started with it. I just wanted to read it first and then I'll tell you how to go through it, etc. And we'll try and solve it like we solve questions. All right. So let me read the poem first for all of you all, and then we'll quickly go through the questions. We are sort of running short of time. I know there are some doubts. Uh, Please leave them in the comment section. We have another class next week, and I'll address them for sure. Okay. Uh, in the darkened room, a woman cannot find her reflection in the mirror. So, a few things about generally about poems. Poems have very few words compared to novels, compared to essays, and that's because the poet ideally has thought very, very, very carefully about each word. And each word that is present in the poem is supposed to indicate some specific meaning to us. Right? So if you have vaguely even tried to read poems or have tried to read about analysis of poetry, you'll know that analysis of poetry is a separate stream in itself, and people argue endlessly about these epic poems. Of course, India has epic poems written in the past, but even non-religious epic poems, people will have long debates about what their interpretation is. So that I'm just telling you that each word has a meaning, and we have to be careful about what it implies. Firstly, the words "a woman" tell us that this applies. It's not the woman, or it's not saying like some name. A woman implies this applies to like some woman, but could apply to women in general. In a darkened room, like I said, could apply to women in general, doesn't have to. In a darkened room tells us that she is somewhere where she cannot see clearly, right? She cannot find her reflection in the mirror. So she cannot see herself. or she cannot find herself, right? This line, the second stanza, waiting as usual, this is really important because this tells us that this is habitual. This happens with her frequently. She's waiting as usual at the edge of sleep. At the edge of sleep, we all have been at the edge of sleep. It's this dreamlike place we are, right? Where reality sort of starts to shift, right? So her image cannot be seen by herself. She can't see herself, and her reality is sort of shifting. It's not clear. Then in her hand, she holds the oil lamp, right? Again, if you notice, the author has chosen an oil lamp specifically because it's a poetic image that comes up in our mind. That's one reason. The other reason, like I said, poets will think very carefully about the word that they choose. This is not like a halogen lamp. This is not like a flashlight. An oil lamp is not the best source of light. Correct? It's a dim source of light. So again, it's a darkened room. She can't look at herself. She can't find herself. This is a usual thing that happens. She's holding a source of light which is not the best source of light. It's a dim source of light, whose drunken yellow flames. Now, why are they called drunken? Drunken because usually authors, the cliche or the trite way to describe flames is to say dancing flames. Drunken is a more negative connotation, right? The flames themselves are shifting, just like her reality here is shifting and she can't see herself. The flames themselves are shifting, and the flames themselves are not a trustworthy source of light. They're moving and they're not a trustworthy source of seeing something. And but this vague imagery, this vague source of light, know where her lonely body hides. So this vague sensation tells us where her lonely body or outline of her body lies. So in short, like if I was to be really reductive and this 21st century, she can't see herself clearly and she is alone. Right? This is what the poem would mean. Right. This is the reading process of the poem. If you notice, for the length of the poem, the time taken or the investment is much more. You have to read it really carefully. Right. Now that we've read the poem, let's look at the questions that are asked from the poem. So, which of the following statements best conveys the theme of the poem? Please go through this and I'll get started with the options. The same process applies. Read each option, go back to the passage or the poem in this case, check if it's acceptable or not, and so on and so forth. All right. Like I said, we need to push through these questions. There's one more question I need to discuss, and we're running short of time. Let me start with the options. Which of the following statements best conveys the theme of the poem, which is basically like the main point of the poem? By the way, theme of the passage is a common question that we all have tackled before. Let's look at option A. The poem revolves around a woman whose liberty has been throttled or has been, stifled, to use a word from today's discussion. The poem revolves around a woman whose liberty has been throttled. Liberty is not exactly being discussed here. If we are to be extremely reductive, this poem is about self and about not seeing self clearly, feeling lonely, right? A combination of these things, right? So we know it's not about liberty. So based on the word liberty or throttling of liberty, let's cancel out option A. Now, option B says the poem explores the quality of life of a woman. Again, quality of life not discussed. We aren't discussing her economic condition, we aren't discussing her social condition. We're talking about what's going on inside her mind as such, how she sees herself. So quality of life, again, invalid, doesn't apply. C, the poem revolves around a woman's feeling of alienation. Alienation is definitely stated in the passage. So C could be the right answer, but we're looking for the best option. So we need to go through options D and E. D says the poem laments or complains about the suffering and the frustration of a woman. Suffering and frustration not discussed. Again, this is more about self. So liberty not discussed, quality of life not discussed, suffering not discussed. E says the poem celebrates her meaningless life. This is obviously invalid. No one would go with E. So the right answer here is option C. The poem revolves around a woman's feeling of alienation. Now, what I want to tell all of y'all is, if you're sort of good at this, or if you practice this analysis of poem like I showed you, and going through the options, the first question of the poem can be tackled by most of us. Granted, it will require more practice than the RC, but it can be solved by most of us, right? Some of you can be really good at this, so make sure those of you who know that it's your strength actually use it as that. Now that we've done with this question, let's see the next one. What do the lines, "the drunken yellow flames know where a lonely body hides," these two lines, what do they best represent? Please get started. All right. I think I know this question is a little trickier than the prior question for sure. And I actually want to use this question to highlight some problem I know about the poetry part of the XAT exam. Is sometimes, especially if you look at the prior papers, sometimes the options given, like I said, poetry and analysis of poetry is something that has been going on for a very long time, and people argue endlessly about this sort of thing. So I know that some of the options that they've created as the correct option sometimes can be disputed, highly contested or disputed. In any case, keeping that aside, we'll try and answer today's question, which is the drunken yellow flames. I told you drunken yellow flames indicate that they can't be trusted as a source of light, right? They're drunken and they're shifting. So they're a vague, unclear. This tells us the vagueness or lack of clarity. This they know where her lonely body hides. So again, her sense of self, her lone sense of self is vaguely known to her. So she vaguely knows her sense of self and she is alone, right? This is what these two lines are trying to highlight. Now let's go through these options. The lines represent flames that highlight the location of her body. Highlighting the location of her body is a literal, going back to our interpretation passage, location of her body is a literal interpretation. This is telling us the outline of her body. But that's not what the passage is talking about. It's the passage is about her sense of self, right? So location of her body would be invalid. Let's look at option E. The lines represent as turbulent emotions of a nameless woman. Turbulent emotions of a nameless woman. Nameless woman is fine. That's what the author or that's what the poet has done. This is acceptable. But turbulent emotions simply is not what these lines indicate. So option E is invalid just based on these lines alone. Let's look at option D. The lines represent flames as forces that are aware of her solitude. The flame knows that she is lonely. Right? This is invalid. This is not stated. The flame knows where her lonely body hides. So the flame sort of vaguely represents her loneliness or her sense of self. But it's not aware of, the flame itself is not aware of her solitude. So invalid, again, literal. A, D, and E are invalid. C says the lines represent flames as her desperate pursuit of her lost self. Her lost self, completely acceptable, right? Her desperate pursuit of her lost self is not what the drunken yellow flames indicate. So these are invalid. The right answer is option B, which is the lines represent flames as distorted memories. Now, the problem with this is, like I said, poems have interpretations and many interpretations can be argued endlessly. This would be a little problematic. I'll tell you why it's acceptable. Flames are distorted because they are drunken yellow flames. This is correct. Distorted would be unclear and moving, shifting, shape shifting. So the lines represent flames as distorted that preserve her identity, that know her somewhat lonely identity, that highlight her identity. Memory, because they know where her lonely body lies. This tells us that there is some sense of memory. There is a vague sense of self. So vague sense of self would reside in lot of memories or one memory, right? So the word memories is therefore acceptable. And what you want to realize is none of the other options come close. So option B is the only best possible choice. There could be better choices, I guarantee, but they aren't presented in these options, right? So option B is the correct choice. All right. So this is how poems are presented. This is how poems can be tackled by us. What I want you to do is go to some previous year papers, solve the entire paper, and solve the poem as a part of that paper. Then take a call whether you want to include that in your XAT attempt or not. I think most of us can solve the first question of the poem. Uh, the time problem is a different problem. If the poem is of this length, then you really need to be good at speed for you to tackle it. But if the poem is of this length, we can definitely tackle the first question, right? We can do this entire reading of the poem in the first question in somewhat in, like, let's say 3 minutes. That's good enough, especially if we need to solve that one question. So it can be done by us. Whether you want to do it or not, I want you to take a educated decision about this. All right. So with this, I want to bring today's class to an end. We have online classes for XAT. You can scan the QR code or you can visit our website and you can find out about these classes and decide whether it's necessary for you to join them or not. And you can scan this code to join the other classes. What I want you to do is, like someone had done with the prior class, you had left some doubts in the comment section. Please leave me some doubts in the comment section so I can actually, within the time frame of the class, include them in the next class and resolve your doubts from today's class and also have some structure for the next class. So that's it today. I hope the class was productive. Do leave some feedback. I'll see you all in the next class. Thank you. Goodbye.